So, no big surprise. There have been a lot of changes and challenges in our business. That's kind of boring. We're not going to talk about that. But all those changes and challenges have also brought a lot of creativity and innovation. And that is a lot more interesting to talk about. And that is what we're going to talk about this afternoon with this panel. I'll briefly introduce everyone, and then everybody's going to talk a little bit more about what work they do and a little bit about the creativity and innovation that takes place in their shop. Right to my left here is Lisa Friedman. She's a climate change reporter at the New York Times. She focuses on federal policy. As she told me just a minute ago, she essentially does obituaries for federal policy right now. So doing great work. And of course, she writes all those stories that your editor writes you about and says, why didn't you have that? Or maybe that's just me, I'm not sure. But, then we have, Alex Harris. It's a little weird because usually I'm talking into a microphone and there's no one on the other side. So it's just going to take me a little minute to get adjusted here. All right, Alex Harris is a climate change reporter with the Miami Herald. She covers how South Florida communities are adapting to climate change. And I was looking through some of your stories. You had a really interesting story last year about climate gentrification and how people who, because of lending policies and redlining, sort of ended up in these higher elevation places. It sounds like away from the preferred properties, and now all of a sudden there are developers coming and saying, oh, that land looks really appealing and safe. And then down on the other end here, we have David Bornstein. He's co-founder and CEO of the Solutions Journalism Network, which encourages reporters to focus more on how people are responding to problems, not just who and what the problems are. And I think we almost should congratulate you because I think the word solutions has been mentioned more than just about any other word over the last couple of days. So what you've been trying to bring to the conversation about journalism, I think, has happened. So let's, while we're kind of talking for a few minutes about what's happening where we work, I want to make sure that this is definitely a two-way conversation because we're talking about creativity and innovation, and we have people from all different sizes of shops and different kinds of media. And so think about things that you've noticed, either where you work or maybe even your competitors, things that you have seen that are very creative, either in how organizations are structured or how you plan your coverage, and even down to individual stories. I want to have kind of a little bit of a brainstorming session even, just a way to kind of get excited about what we're doing here because we're doing really important work. So that's going to come up in a few minutes, and think about ways you might be able to contribute to that conversation if you would. So first of all, we're just going to have that, each person is going to talk for a few minutes about where they work and what's really important to them and ways that they're trying to bring some creativity and innovation to this topic of climate change reporting. So we'll start with you, Lisa.
Well, thank you so much for having me here. I'm a climate reporter at the New York Times. I've been there about 2.5 years. I still have a massive case of imposter syndrome, which I'm told ends in like 5 to 10. So, but what I'm part of is a incredibly innovative in and of itself team that the Times created. We have 15 people on a climate team at the New York Times. That's reporters, editors, multimedia reporters, and all of us have been the Times launched this a few years ago because it recognized that this was the story of our time. And one of the things that we try to do, often we get questions from readers, how come there isn't, a standalone climate change section? And I think there expressly isn't, because one of the things we also try to do is weave what we know in with every other part of the paper because, and I'm sure this has been, expressed multiple times over the past couple days, climate change is part of every other story. So we cover the gamut. We cover, international issues, business, what climate change means on the ground in communities in the U.S. and around the world. As you mentioned, I cover federal policy. It's like the only big joke I get sometimes, so I gave it to you. I now write obits for Obama-era climate policy. We're talking about innovation here, and I feel a little self-conscious because, our team does like amazing, beautiful data-driven visual journalism. I do a little less of that than some others on our team. I'm a very traditional, policy reporter, but all the ways that you work, I work. I mean, I look for people to tell my stories through. And try all the time to think of ways to sort of boil down things in a way that I can help explain why policy matters to people. Just briefly by way of background, I want to say that I didn't come to this beat as a climate reporter or a science reporter. I started working at newspapers when I was a teenager in New Jersey. I was an intern. I followed reporters around to fires and murders and plane crashes and city council meetings. And I worked briefly at the Village Voice, where I realized that I am neither good at nor do I want to really tell my own stories. I'm much more interested in what other people think and know, and to tell people those stories. I worked for the Las Vegas Review-Journal. I worked for the Bakersfield Californian. I covered police beat for years and years. I wanted to be a police reporter for the rest of my life at one point. I got the editor and publisher yearbook and the FBI uniform crime statistics, and I applied to papers around the country that had really high crime rates, which is how I got to Bakersfield. I wound up in Washington, and everyone here knows how newspapers went and have gone. I was slowly climbing the ladder of newspapers when all the rungs fell out under me. I landed it completely by accident at a publication called E&E. I worked for Climate Wire. I really thought to myself, wow, covering climate change, how long can I cover just one subject? Maybe I'll do that, for a year until newspapers rebound. And, 10 years later, it is the best beat I have ever had. And again, as everyone here knows, it is a beat about everything from the time you wake up in the morning and switch on the lights and, how we get our energy, where our food comes from. It all intersects with this issue. And so those are some of the things I think about every day as I'm covering the beat, and we can come back to specifics, but that's my sort of origin story on this.
And one thing I wanted to ask you about too is, every week I get a newsletter from your team, the Climate Forward newsletter. And what sort of how do you decide what's going to be in there? I notice often there's, it starts with what you can do, which gets to, I guess, the solutions, sort of.
Yeah, it's gone through a lot of iterations as we have sort of figured out what our readers want. And I think, one of the things we've found over the couple years that we've had this newsletter up and running is that people really do want solutions. They want, they want to know the extent of the problem. They want to be able to understand the science, but they also want to know what they can do. And so while in our stories, and especially my stories, I feel like lean heavily toward the point of view that there are systemic changes that need to be made that can only be made at, oftentimes at a national policy level. That doesn't mean that there are not, individual things that everyone can do, from changing the time they do their laundry to some of the things that Emily Holden writes about recently, which is, thinking about, what kind of cup you're using on your coffee and reusing your lids on your coffee cup.
So, Alex, let's talk a little bit about your job. And I was looking through your stories, you really do a mix. I mean, you've got the feature stories like the climate gentrification story, but then every time a storm comes through, you're on it.
That's a new addition. So I'm going to follow Lisa's footsteps here and talk a little bit about how I got to where I am at the paper. So I did a lot of breaking news for the first year I got there. I covered higher education for 5 minutes, and then something called reinvention happened. So McClatchy, the company that owns all 28 papers in the chain, including the Miami Herald, came through and said, we need to rethink our relationship with our audience. And that meant losing a movie critic, a dance critic, some local government reporters, but it also meant gaining some topic-based coverage that seemed to appeal. And one of them was my job. So I got a climate change beat, which was a dream come true for me. And we still also have an environmental reporter, which I feel really lucky that we have both of those people. And in the resulting shakeup, I also got hurricanes added, which, as we kind of saw on some of these other presentations, is very fit. So I get to cover Dorian as we think it's going to hit us, doesn't think it's going to hit us, think it's going to hit us, think it's not going to hit us, which was a very exciting week. And then I also get to cover climate change. And something I'm really grateful for at the local level is there's a lot of wonderful national reporting out there. It's really important whether we're in these treaties. It's really important the Clean Power Plan and all these great national and federal level policies are really important, and they have a lot of impact. But what we've really seen is, especially in the state of Florida, we have had a lack of state leadership, and it really falls to local governments. And in Miami specifically, we have a community where the question of is it happening is thankfully been solved. We know it. We see it. My street I live on floods really regularly. My car has a little rust at the bottom of it now, which is great. I moved to the beach, and I'm sort of regretting it. And it's a wonderful place to live, and everyone there has sort of agreed that this is a problem, we need to talk about it. And even our local elected officials, even our state senator, Marco Rubio, recently, our federal senator, Marco Rubio, recently joined the Bipartisan Climate Solutions Caucus, which is a big change for him from a couple of years ago. And what I get to focus on is how is the local community adapting to climate change? Are we going to build a seawall in a rich neighborhood? Are we going to build it in a poor neighborhood? Are we protecting against climate gentrification, which is a really fascinating issue that we're going to see more of, I'm sure. I'm sure New Orleans is probably up there as well. But the issue is basically after years of racist redlining policy, Black and brown communities were shoved near the railroad tracks, which is the highest ground, and kept away from the desirable property, which was the low-lying, beautiful beachfront. And now that sea levels are rising, developers are like, wait a minute. Not really what I want. So they're trying to move into these higher elevation communities, and they're being pointed that way by experts who come in and say, the Urban Land Institute even says it, like sustainable development means in the future you should be transit-oriented, you should have density, and you should be on high ground. Well, that high ground is Little Haiti. That high ground is Little Havana. That high ground is these communities where it's all low bungalows, and they're being replaced by giant developments. And even homeowners, our single-family homeowners, are starting to look to those communities and say, if I'm going to buy a house, it's cheaper. I can gentrify that area, and I can have a safer investment and cheaper flood insurance. So we're starting to see that pressure and that collision in our neighborhood in a way that's not really happening in a lot of other places. Which is why it's really interesting to be able to write about this. We've heard a lot about the last couple of days about the health angle of climate change, and I have found in my hyper-local climate change reporting that the two issues that really resonate with my readers are health and money. Real estate really is a big deal for us. How much is your flood insurance going to cost? How much is your wind insurance costing? Is the market changing? Is the value of your home dropping because of climate change? One of the most successful, one of the most well-read stories I've written in the last 2 years was a tool that I don't remember who made it, but it was how much value your property has lost due to sea level rise. And you could type in your address and it'd say, your home is worth $800,000. It should have been worth $900,000, but the discount in the market because of elevated sea rise is affecting it. And that people ate that up because it was personal and it was relevant to them and their lives. And I think that that's what I really admire what the work of Climate Matters in the Newsroom and Climate Central does, because it really helps you bring it to your readers and say, this is great. Like the Paris Agreement's cool, federal policy is wonderful, but your street floods, and you need to go to Commissioner Ken Russell and say, elevate my street. you need to go to these public meetings, you need to have these conversations. And I feel like the great thing about what we've been doing there is that we've really seen those conversations be facilitated by these stories. People bring them to the meetings. I wrote a story once about some sunny day flooding we had, and an octopus popped through a parking garage. Oh my God, I remember that. And was floating in someone's parking garage. And the best thing that's ever happened to me is someone dressed up in an octopus costume, laminated my story, and went to a city government meeting holding that and said, we need to have action on climate change, which is, Pulitzers, who cares? But it's just a really, I think the reason that I'm on this panel is actually not because of that, although that's cool, is that we have done something really neat in Florida really recently, and we've created the Florida Climate Reporting Network, which is a collaboration between, I genuinely do not know how many news outlets at this point. They're pouring in. I think it's 18 outlets in the state, which is newspapers all the way from North Florida, Central Florida, South Florida. We got the Keys involved. We've got West Coast, East Coast. We've got big newspapers. We've got small newspapers. We've got radio stations. We've all got together, and we have a big Slack channel, and we share each other's stories. So I wasn't around for the climate gentrification story, but someone at the local radio station in Miami just did a 3-part podcast with NPR at the Stakes on that climate gentrification issue. It was wonderful. You should all listen to it. Nadej Green is a treasure. And they wrote a story with that and was shared among all 18 publications. So we really amplify each other's coverage. And it's kind of weird because you'd think we're all competing, and we are competitors in a lot of other ways. But on this one issue, we've decided to drop the guns and share each other's stories constantly. And in shrinking newspaper times, it's great because it means you get more in your print publication. It means you get more coverage to share digitally. It means you get more local climate stories, and local in the sense of Tampa doesn't really apply to Miami, but it's better than the AP that's just talking about something happening in DC and New York. And we've also gotten some grant funding recently, from the Pulitzer Center to do 2 big statewide projects, which we're looking at the ways in climate change has already changed in Florida. So all 18 newsrooms are collaborating on that data project, and we're all going to report on it. And then a separate project of what are the first places to go in the state? And the idea is to look at it with a solutions-oriented lens and say, this community is most at risk in the earliest timeline. What are they doing to stop it? So that's been an adventure trying to figure out how to make that collaboration work.
Well, and I think that's a good segue to get a sort of a refresher about solutions journalism, and then tell us a little bit about some of the interesting work you're doing.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I've been a reporter for 27 years now. For the last almost 10 years, I've been working on this column in the New York Times called Fixes, which is a reported column that looks at solutions to social problems. It's reported, but it lives in the opinionator section of the Times. Sort of out of that experience, about 6 years ago, a bunch of journalists came together and started this network, the Solutions Journalism Network, because there was a felt sense among a lot of journalists that journalism was kind of like a 30-minute doctor's appointment where the first 29 and a half minutes were all telling you how sick you are, and the last 30 seconds are what your treatment options are. And it was really creating a lot of negative causes in society. But the problem was a lot of journalists were uncomfortable with reporting on solutions because as soon as they started talking about it, they felt that they would fall into advocacy or puffery or sort of feel-good news and stuff like that. And so there was this sense of wanting to do it, but not really having a framework or a language to do it with rigor. So that's kind of why the network was set up, this idea that defining solutions journalism as just rigorous reporting that looks at how people are responding to a problem, what results they're getting, and what we can learn from it. And if the results that they're getting are negative or it's not working, that's a good story too, because you can learn from failure just as much as you can learn from success. So that's kind of the purpose of the network, was to sort of legitimize that as a reporting process, to integrate it into the mainstream news. We've worked with about 400 news organizations, cumulatively. Currently have about 208 kind of engagements ongoing now. And about 2/3 of our partners are between the coasts. So there's a lot of red state, red county, small, medium-sized news organizations. And the challenge of how reporters on a regular basis kind of get this into the news, what does it really mean to do, is quite actually, I think, an innovation that we're seeing. A lot of what we're learning from is kind of just sort of being the spider at the center of the web and being able to see the creativity in the network and then sort of be a bit of a switchboard to share that. So we do a lot of events where essentially journalists are teaching other journalists based on what they did. So one of the biggest I guess, insight, or one of the biggest learnings for us has been that solutions journalism turns out to be a really great accountability mechanism, and it's actually spreading more and more as an accountability tool. And the rationale is pretty simple. You can't really hold people accountable for bad performance unless you can show that better performance is possible. And in fact, when you do show that someone else is doing something smarter, there's 3,300 counties in the United States. If you look for what we call the positive deviance on almost any issue, you'll find that just like there's terrible performers on the left end of the curve, there's positive deviance on the right end. There's other counties that are doing something smarter with regard to agriculture, or reducing the risk of forest fires, or better protecting against rising sea levels, or drought, or whatever the thing is. There's always positive deviance in a country as large as the United States. And if it's not in the United States, there are in other countries too. So once reporters realize that, oh, I can actually report on something smart happening elsewhere, and then relocalize that story to sort of bring that back to my community, they start realizing that my local beat is not just what happens here, especially around an issue like climate, it's what's happening anywhere that my community could benefit from learning about. And that has created a really exciting job for journalists, and a real problem because nobody has travel funds to look at these things. So in fact, last year we gave about $2 million in subgrants, and a lot of it was just for travel to look at something smart happening elsewhere, another community doing something smart in response to opioids or in response to forest fires or something, and then actually bringing that to the local conversation, and then often having engagement, like here's 3 or 4 different models that we've seen for the way other communities are dealing with a problem that we're actually standing still on. Let's have a conversation, and what are the implications for us? Now, the news organization is not advocating for any of these approaches. They're saying, here's 4 models. There may be 20 others. These are the ones we found. These are the ones we had access to. We had the money to drive there to look at them. There's always constraints, especially with the local news organizations. So it's really starting a conversation around possibilities and options. Basically, what are our options, rather than only what are our problems? And so that's really, I think, probably the biggest thing. The second biggest thing is just, we now see that news, journalists, the metaphor for journalists has always been sort of a watchdog, and journalists have said that this is a good way to sharpen the teeth of the watchdog, because it does create that competitive pressure, or kind of a FOMO idea, like our community is not benefiting from an idea that other communities are benefiting from. Why is that the case? We're not, they're not smarter than we are, and in fact, they may not even have more money than we do, but they're just ahead of us on thinking about this issue. The other thing is, it's kind of journalists as bees, in the sense of, like, we now see that through this process, ideas kind of get cross-pollinated from one place to another. And we have lots of examples of journalists who have gone to 3 or 4 other cities or 3 or 4 other communities, brought back an idea, and then the community begins to explore that idea, and in some cases, actually will go and look at the other community to see if we can learn from them. So the switchboarding idea of adaptive responses or adaptive resilience is another big opportunity. That's really good for local, and it's also great for chains. Like, I'll give you one example, and then I'll pause. One of our local news partners is the Carlsbad Current Argus, which is a tiny news organization with a print subscription of 3,500 that did this extraordinarily good series looking at how to reduce wastewater contamination or recycle wastewater from fracking, which is a big problem, or a big issue, a big problem in the Permian Basin in eastern New Mexico. They wrote that story. They wrote about 15 stories. They really looked at what can be done better to prevent and actually prevent the loss of billions of gallons, billions of barrels of wastewater. That story was picked up by 40 other Gannett or USA Today partners because it was a relevant story in their communities as well. So this tiny community, this tiny news organization was able to reach 1 million people with this story because it was essentially servicing a model that had relevance to many, many other communities. And that's sort of one of the opportunities that we're seeing in journalism. It's this idea of being able to, in some ways, be a little bit of an R&D department for your community, and then to be able to learn from other places as well.
We have, I'm sorry.
No, I was just saying that's neat.
We have people from all different sizes of organizations here, and I'll talk a little bit about something we've done at NPR, because we've got the network, and then we've got member stations all around the country. I don't know, hundreds of them, and they're all different sizes too. And we knew that we wanted to boost our environment and energy reporting, but we're, nonprofit, and we don't have 15 reporters on a climate desk like the New York Times does. But we wanted to do more, and when we looked around at a lot of those member stations, we saw that there were many reporters who were doing really great work, and that work deserved to have a bigger platform. So exactly like the newspaper you were talking about. And so we created this collaborative team of people. We went through a process where we had certain criteria where you had to be at a certain level of reporting to be a part of the team, and brought them all in. And now we all meet once a week, and we share ideas. A lot of those folks kind of get first in line if they're going to be pitching a story to the network. And I would say it's not, I wouldn't say it's perfected. It's still definitely a work in process, because it's really difficult to create a team when you don't have control of everyone's time. And you really have to pity the editors, because they also have to be ambassadors and diplomats and be able to sweet talk news directors at a local station and convince folks that there's a reason to contribute to the network. But it's been a really interesting experience, because I work by myself out of my house in Philadelphia, and I'm sitting there by myself all day, and I talk to my editor, but this is something that we're doing every week. There's anywhere from 10 to 20 of us all getting on a telephone line and sharing ideas, and new stories come out of that. So I know that for those of us who don't have a lot of resources, collaboration, I guess, is one of the key innovation and creativity things that are happening now. I think I just want to talk about maybe something that you've done in your organization that you're especially proud of. It could be an individual story, or a project, or anything that you think sort of fits with this model of innovation and creativity. And I'd like to hear first from you a little bit more about working in some of these areas where if you start with a headline of climate change, some people might just bypass it, essentially red state areas. So what's some of the work that you're doing there?
Yeah, well, I think Lisa really framed it. I mean, climate is a meta story. For people like, we were talking, I think it was Sean before mentioned the regenerative agriculture. I mean, there's so many places across the United States now, and most of them are red places, red counties or red states, where soil fertility is a huge issue. And farmers are doing cover cropping, and they are doing no-till, and they are already on board with the fact that we have to adapt. Now, these are places that historically, haven't necessarily, where, I think 60% of Americans now say, that now acknowledge that climate is a problem, or either alarmed or concerned about it, according to the Yale Center. But still, there's a lot of places where the news organization won't lead with climate change in the headline, but they'll talk about, agriculture, or they'll talk about water management. So we're seeing news organizations across the country using and getting into this story by dealing with local needs, focusing on responses that actually provide benefits at the local level, which is a really good story, and then coming from locally trusted stakeholders, or these are journalists, or they may be the local meteorologist or whatever. The research shows that that's the best way. If there is motivated denial or climate skepticism, that's the best combination of things to overcome that. There's a phrase, a lot of journalists feel like you should trust me because I'm telling the truth. But that's not really how trust works. Trust is more a function of relationship. But it's more like, I don't care what you know until I know that you care, is a way that people figure out trust. So showing that you care is a really important way to build up trust if you want to get people to deal with something That's a hard thing to deal with. A very good way to show that you care is to try to be helpful. And actually, that's essentially what solutions journalism is. It's a way of helping people understand that they have more options than they realize. Credible, rigorous, evidence-supported options. So I'm sort of proud that I guess, to get to your question, I feel like there's been so much focus on misinformation and the problem of trust and engagement in journalism. And I feel like what's buried into that is this unexamined belief that you should just trust us. You should just trust us. We don't have to show you our work. We don't have to show you how we got all this information. And we don't even have to show you that we're deeply committed to the health of the community. Just trust us, because it's the First Amendment kind of thing. And I think we have a lot of local news organizations that are actually saying, no, we got to really earn it back.
Mm-hmm. And I'll ask either of you if you had anything specifically that you wanted to bring up, or we could start a little conversation with the...
Well, I mean, I think, at the time, I mean, we've done some incredible projects. I mean, one of my, I think one of the things that I think we've been able to do because of the resources and the way we've been thinking about things at the Times, our editor, Hannah Fairfield, comes from graphics. She comes from the world of visual journalism, which is unusual to have an editor who is not from, the traditional news side. But one of the benefits is that on every topic, we are always thinking about, like, how can we tell this story in a different way and in a new way? This is a year old or so now, but one of my favorite things that the Times has done since I've been there is a piece that I think that the headline is how hot was it when you, oh God, why didn't I write this?
How hot was it when you were born?
How hot was it when you were born?
Project.
You can look up by your hometown, the number of over 90-degree days in your hometown, the year you were born, currently, and what's projected by the end of the century. And it is flipping terrifying. But it's also so visceral and great. My colleague John Schwartz, recently did a project where we thought about, like, well, how do we tell the story of renewable energy? And often this stuff comes down to people, and he told the stories of, 6 people in renewable energy fields, one who had come from a fossil fuel background and moved into renewable energy. I think it was, I don't want to misstate it, but I think it was the solar business, and taking these big ideas and bringing them down to a personal level. But I think for my part on the policy end, I mean, one of the things that collaboration, means for us is when there's something happening, our desk, the climate desk, is always talking to other desks. When there is a storm or a fire, we're talking to the climate desk. What do we need to send some smart paragraphs to the person who's on the ground in California or Louisiana? Do we need to do a separate story to explain to people, here's a quick reminder of here's the ways that climate change intersects with wildfires. How do we tell it? What's the best way to do it? And we have those conversations all the time. And I know not every news organization has the, resources and number of people to do it in the same way, but that's the kind of thinking that goes into kind of every big news story. Is there an apt climate discussion to have, and how do we tell it?
Yeah, you mentioned you felt like an imposter, and I am not a science journalist in any way. I'm an accidental. I'm accidentally covering climate change because and fortunately we have a science desk with Giselle, our science editor, who, when all those difficult questions come up, I just ask them and they tell me what to say. But we
still call Justin Gillis sometimes, even though he's gone.
And I started covering energy only because after the 2010 Gulf oil spill, we looked around NPR and there was like no one who knew anyone at an oil company. And we were like, oh, that's not cool. This is a huge business. And so I was essentially assigned to get to know people at oil companies. And I started with the idea that not every energy story is an environment story. That was my mandate. And that was my mandate for a couple of years. And it was really interesting to have that sort of boundary put on what I was supposed to do. Other people were still covering climate issues in the way that we should be doing. But that really freed me up to like explore within my little pasture. But now, of course, we've expanded that a lot more. And Alex, I'd like to hear if there's, you've already talked about the octopus. I don't know if you can really top that, but.
Nothing will top that octopus story. But no, I think what I'm the most proud of what I've seen in the last couple of years doing this is that we have built a readership for it, which is we're still building. It's still a process. We're still testing every single day. Do you put climate change in the headline? Will it turn people off? Do you put it later in the story? People read a lot more about hurricanes and flooding than they do about climate change. We're still trying to test with our readers. Health is something that's working. Not every health. Not all the heat stress stories do well. Mosquito stories do really well. And we're still trying to figure out what our audience wants and figuring out how to fit it into other parts of the newsroom. So that's something I spend a lot of time doing is I go over to the real estate desk and I say, hey, I'm going to write a story about blah, blah, blah. But I hear that you're going to write about this new affordable housing complex and they're going to do some PACE clean energy work with some of these low-income homes and they're going to put more roofs and windows and efficient AC. Well, let me explain why that's a climate story and send some smart paragraphs like you said. Or go over to the City of Miami desk and be like, hey, I know you're moderating a candidate forum tonight. Will you ask this question, this question, this question? And they ask it. It's really been infusing that throughout our newsroom, and it's great because people will come up to me now and be like, "Does this have anything to do with climate change?" I'm like, "Yes," and I don't. It always does. You got it. And the thing is, the thing that I appreciate is I don't necessarily have to write those smart paragraphs now. Some of my colleagues have started to get it, and they're like, "We just send me an article, and I can summarize it and have like a link in there." I'm like, "Yeah, great. Here you go." Or, "What other stories have you written in the past that I should link to in my coverage?" And that's been really great because we're kind of diffusing it throughout the newsroom and really getting coverage throughout the paper, and even choosing which APs we pick. When the IPCC report came out, I wasn't doing something that day, but the page director said, "Should we run something? Is this important?" I was like, yes. Pick something, pick a national story. We tossed a couple of localized details, and then we had like the Florida-centric story the next day. But it's really been that. It's just been building it from the ground up of what it looks like. I mean, this paper has covered climate change forever. There's been front page stories. I found a front page story on climate change explaining Florida's doom in 2000. So we've been doing it for a while. It's not new, but the dedication we've all started to show and the editorial support for it is new. And I'm really proud of that at our paper.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So I would like to hear if you have any questions for any folks here or any ideas to share. Like I said, I'd like for us to share different ways that we've changed structures in our newsrooms or even individual story ideas. Go ahead.
So having the three of you on the line here is a perfect setup. When Alex puts together a consortium of 18 big and small papers all over the place and comes up with some awesome work, and David, you can provide some gas money and some guidance to help put that together, and the goal is to get this to the New York Times' audience, without necessarily the New York Times coming and parachuting in and redoing what you guys did all the groundwork and had all the local trust to create. How do we, to correctly use Susan's term, how do we turn this into a positive feedback loop that keeps these local trusted organizations empowered with something more than just gas money, that keeps them in salaries and readership and local trust and local effectiveness, and still gets it up to the New York Times' audience?
Is that for you?
Well, I mean, I'm kind of curious, what, from your experience, I mean, I don't know what it's like, honestly, at the Times to try, for outside news organizations to try to, share or, be part of have our paper or other big papers be part of a consortium like that. Is it hard to get us to be a part of things? Because
we actually have a lot of news collaborations that we've helped organize or we've worked with. Probably about 80 news organizations now in our network are in some sort of a collaboration. The largest is in Philadelphia, where there's we're not running it. It's an organization called Resolve Philadelphia, but we helped get it going. All reporting on economic justice, 22 news organizations in Philadelphia. So this is happening more and more. I don't think the Times is sort of an outlier in almost every respect, but putting the New York Times aside, the idea that you can create news collaborations where organizations not only cross-publish each other's stories. We had a collaboration across Western Montana of a dozen news organizations that were all reporting on mental health. What works to improve mental health outcomes in a state that has one of the highest suicide rates? They together produced more than, I think, 45 stories. They were able to cross-publish any one. This actually works well with the solutions model because it's a bit like potluck journalism. I mean, 45 ways to actually help with mental health is very different than 45 stories that say we have high suicide rates. You can only read 2 of those and then it's enough. But here's a teen model, here's a local model, here's a model with how you educate gun shop owners not to sell guns to people who are depressed. I mean, that's an actual story. Those are things you can cross-pollinate them and borrow ideas that were sort of surfaced in other places. I think that's going to happen more. The Knight Foundation is really behind this collaborative journalism model. There's Collaborative Journalism Summit at Montclair State University. So I would say that that's one example. I can't speak for the Times, but I think it's going to happen more and more in journalism. It's a great way to make use of fewer resources and still cover an issue in depth.
Yeah, it's an exciting model.
Collaborations are awesome. We love ours now. It's a new cool thing for us, but it doesn't pay any money. And that's the issue, right? Is like, I'd love it if The Guardian were to come down and say, let's do a story together on climate gentrification. The double byline is great for my career. It's great for The Guardian to have a trusted local person. It's great for the Miami Herald to get picked up in The Guardian. Like that's nice juice for your audience, but it does not pay my rent. And it does not allow the Miami Herald to keep staffing our local government reporters. And I think that's a really good question of like, where does that money come in? And I think that money right now comes from nonprofit grantees. It does not come from necessarily the Washington Post saying, hey, we'd love to collaborate in a story and we'll pay for the photographer, we'll pay for the data journalism, we'll pay for this. It really looks like, hey, you guys are doing great work, can we hire your people away? And I'm really interested in what that looks like because I think that some of these collaborations are really wonderful tools for weaker journalism in this era of less resources, not weaker journalism, but in the era of less resources, partnerships make a lot of sense. But the financial side hasn't been figured out, and I don't know anyone who's doing it in the way you're talking about, but I'd love to hear ideas.
Yeah. You're in Missoula. Do you have any answers to your own question? Coming from a...
I'm actually going to be having a conversation with some folks at the Times next week about this because if we don't get paid, we die.
Yeah.
Do you work with Kathy Best?
Yes.
Yes. So we worked with her when she was at the Seattle Times under a project called Education Lab, which actually has raised a lot of money from philanthropy. There's a great model there that more than $2 million, I believe, that they raised for the Education Lab, for something called Traffic Lab, and for I think it's called Project Homeless. 3 solutions-oriented verticals that they created that are largely supported by local philanthropy.
Right. But to use your example of the mental health story in Montana, 3 of the people who were involved in that collaboration are now out of work. Because one-off projects, even fully funded one-off projects, are awesome, but what do you do next week?
Well, now there's a network where they're trying to raise the money, and they've created a local network, and they're trying to raise it from local philanthropy. So that's the next step. Can they do it? There's quite a number of news organizations that we actually just did a revenue summit in north central Ohio, looking at a dozen news organizations that had been successful raising money from community foundations, from local sponsorship, trying to figure out, what can we learn from each other to do this more systematically. There's obviously a lot of ethical issues, but there's also a lot of ethical issues with everything right now in journalism. So, but the takeaway was there's a lot of opportunities here to do things and to fund journalism in new ways. And of course, the Salt Lake Tribune just became a nonprofit, and that's another avenue that a lot of news organizations, I think, are going to explore. They got their nonprofit status very quickly.
Yes, in the back.
Yeah, this question's for Alex and David. I was wondering, like, as a result of the news sharing operations, do you find yourself like actually expanding the scope of your work so that the other member organizations, it would apply to them? Like with the real estate story, did you create a database that like all the members could use?
That's a great question. I do have started to think more about like what would be useful for the network to pick up. And I've started personally trying to be a little more statewide in my coverage. It used to be hyper local. And now sometimes I'll toss an extra line into saying, next in the list of most vulnerable places was Tampa Bay or was Naples or whatever. And I'll flag it in the Slack channel and I'll say, hey, Naples, this is something you might want. Or, hey, everyone, this is pretty statewide. I kept it pretty general. I did a story on flood disclosure laws recently, and I interviewed a woman in Palm Beach, which is a separate county from where I live, flagged it for the Palm Beach Post, but it was statewide. We have not yet gotten to the point where I can open up the data, but another nice thing about this collaboration is when something like what Climate Matters in the Newsroom comes through, instead of having 6 people write the story, 1 person writes it, and we share it in all of our networks. So it does free up time that you can do other stories because you think, okay, someone's going to do that soldier heat study that just came out from the Union of Concerned Scientists. In this case, it was me. So the 5 other people who were thinking about doing it didn't have to do it. And that does free up resources for bigger other projects.
I didn't even realize you were from Montana. That was funny. Most of the collaborations, I think all of them, but maybe I'm not 100% sure of that, have grown because the Montana one now has 18 news organizations in it instead of 12. Philadelphia started with 15 and now is up to 22. What happens is the combined asset of all these stories becomes more valuable. In Philadelphia, it's really good at agenda setting for the city now, because when you have so many news organizations covering poverty, when they have events, I mean, they get anyone they want, basically, to come to those events. So it has a real power. The combined power is greater than the sum of the parts, I think. Was that answering your question? I feel like I missed.
That answers a different question,
A
but
different-
also is
okay.
very interesting.
Okay. we also do have a database where we have like 8,000 stories that we've taken from the network that are examples of solutions journalism that are all tagged in different ways. It's a great way to look at how people are responding to any issue around the country. But for example, all the Philadelphia stories are in there, and you can search and see, through that database, what's happening across Philadelphia with regard to economic justice.
We had another question over here, yes?
Just sort of a plug and a question. My name is Carmen. I'm the director of a program called Journalists Resource at the Harvard Shorenstein Center. And our whole goal is to get journalists to ask and answer the question in the course of their reporting, what does the academic research say about this topic? And with the knowledge that journalists don't have time to pour through tons and tons of research papers, we provide research roundups and tip sheets and single articles about research. And in the past year and a half, I've been trying to be more proactive and form collaborations. And Leah Todd, who's the New England Solutions Journalist Network, recently hooked us up with the Burlington Free Press. And they were working on a story package about opioid recovery programs, and came to us saying, what does the research say about workplace opioid recovery programs? So we ended up doing a dedicated, what does the research say about this story, in conjunction with them, published it on their website, published it on ours. It worked really well, and we're hoping to up the ante and start working more with newsroom collaboratives. So one, I want to say that we want to be the research desk for local news outlets all over the country. So please go to our website and come to me. And if you have...
Say the URL again?
It's journalistsresource.org, and the Twitter feed is @journoresource. But the question I had for you was, what surprised me, and maybe I was being really naive, I haven't been there that long, but was that reporters at a for-profit newsroom run by Gannett still had to go out and take the time to apply for reporting grants like this. And I was wondering how that process worked. Because it's great that they're getting the grants, but it didn't seem so great that they're having to take the time to be writing grant proposals when they should be writing stories.
I mean, I think most of the news organizations that have applied for grants are for-profits, in name. I mean, we have some news organizations that have funded new positions entirely from local community grants and things like that. I mean, historically, solutions journalism has been more enterprise reporting, so it's been a deeper dive, and a lot of places, like when we surveyed all the 208 news organizations and asked them, is there institutional buy-in for this? And it was like 93% said yes. And then when we asked, are you regularly doing this? It was like 47%. So that almost 50-point gap is the friction in the system. It's basically, how do you find these stories more easily, more quickly? So data and evidence and research is really important. These stories, journalists just feel they need a lot more research to do a solution story, because like in journalism, if you look, if you're too critical, it's a misdemeanor, but if you look naive, it's a felony, right? So like we really want to make sure that we're standing on solid ground, so that takes time. And I guess those are sort of the major reasons why people have historically either not done it or looked for resources to do it.
You have a question?
On the reporting networks, I'm curious, is there a role for or a place within those for TV and radio news, and what can that look like? Because it could shave your name off of a story that you reported if it went to radio, unless you wanted to write in a whole different form. So what is that role? What can it look like?
Yeah, we actually have 3 radio stations in our network, and they're great, and because they usually just run our story in full on their website. And when they do audio pieces, we occasionally, it's something that we've written on before, and we embed the audio in our print coverage. And occasionally it's just a script they write. It's something really short. But the 3 radio stations that are part of our collaboration have really robust web presences, and digital is really important to them. And so they usually have like a lot of multimedia, and some of these are like larger projects they've worked on. But we can't always just pick up something that's just plain audio, so they have to attach text to it, which is an inherent limitation of our mediums. And we don't have any TV stations yet, although I think that's something we'd like. We've heard some interest from them. The TV stations report newspaper stories all the time. They just don't say where they got from. No, but we have a news collaboration with a local news, which is CBS4, and they don't do a lot of climate coverage. That's something I've been talking to a partnership about, how to increase their climate coverage. Maybe we need to have some of our reporters on air. Maybe we need to introduce them to sources. They cover flooding because that's very visual, but it's hard. I mean, there's limitations to the visual medium and the audio medium that you can't, like print, you can do lots of things. But yeah, the radio has been really great. And as we start working on these projects, we're already starting to talk about how we're going to co-report. So for one of my projects, which is how to identify the top places that are going to be the first to go in Florida. One of the radio reporters is coming along with me when we both had these conversations with scientists, and she recorded that, and she's going to have a standalone audio piece on how do you come up with this tipping point? How do you come up with this threshold? What's the scientific standard behind it? And so we've been talking about how to co-report, and that's kind of it's unique for us.
Can I ask? I'm sorry, but
go ahead.
How easy would it be for a group of newspapers in New Jersey or Montana to recreate the consortium that you've done in Florida?
Super straightforward. People in Georgia have been asking us to be a part of it, and we're like, just do your own. Just make Georgia. And I know Columbia Journalism Network has already gotten together its own consortium of climate change reporting in the Midwest, if I'm correct. No one's nodding wrong. Okay, I think that's where it is. And there's been talk of other collaborations, and the people who fund, one of the funders from Climate Matters called and was like, hey, how do we fund something like this? How do we get one of these started? And it can be really organic. There's no startup money. You just have to open a Slack and make your editors do it. Which if you guys are interested in starting one in your local area, it really doesn't take that much. Of course, there's also other great people who can facilitate those networks, and maybe it would have been better, a little less rocky in the beginning if we'd gone through a more structured process, but the Solutions Journalism Network is awesome, and we rely on them a lot for regular, like how to find other solutions-oriented stories in our newsroom.
Yeah, and we have a resource on our website called the Collaboration Playbook, which explains how the Philadelphia one and others that came into being. It's all free, so you can get that.
Yes.
Fascinated by this, and thank you to all of you for doing what you're doing, because I feel like being the person in your newsroom that reaches across to other people in the newsroom is the most overlooked and important job.
Yeah.
And it's so often the environment reporters who have to do that. I have been trying to work a lot more with local reporters, because I've found that I've realized that we're not competitors, and they are a huge resource for me, and I like to think that we can be a resource for them. I totally understand what you're saying, that
that can seem kind of like we're kind of like borrowing expertise and like not giving back resources. In the cases that I've done it, it's usually like a project that's so big that you really just need two reporters who are like experts on something to work together with different perspectives. So I think that's been really fruitful for us. But what I struggle with is like sometimes when I'm pitching these, it just sounds so complicated that my editors are like, why can't you just do that yourself? Which I can do, and they're very supportive in this in general, but I get where they're coming from, right? Like just write it yourself, we don't have to go through all the editors, we don't have to agree on the copy, we don't have to do all this, but it seems like our stories would have a lot more impact if we're publishing them like both the local and national level. So I'm just really interested in how you think what you're doing, collaborating locally and regionally could be applied to like what national newspapers could do with local reporters, because I think like part of it is we have to establish that we need to have that kind of relationship before we can talk about resources. So I usually get the like right now I just started doing it. My editors are very supportive of that. And I think once we prove it a little bit, they're like, okay, like that's a normal team. Like they're all sane over there. They're not going to do anything crazy. We agree on what journalism looks like. And then we can move on from there for like bigger projects. But I kind of have to like, we have to like bridge that first, right? Because we do such different things that I have to be like, no, like this reporter's great, the editors are great, they get what we want to do with this. I'm interested in tips you have for like how that could work better.
Yeah, and everything is a case-by-case basis. What works for some newsrooms might not work for others. I mean, the language you guys use, climate crisis, isn't something that anybody in Florida uses. And for most of us, that's fine. But there are some outlets that maybe would be like, well, we don't want to put that in our, like there's differences, right? And any collaboration is tough. The Miami Herald's done a ton of them. We do them with outlets from South America. We do them with The Trace in January. For us, we're pretty used to collaborations. And the first collaboration is always the hardest because you have to say, like, do we agree on what journalism is? And the way that some of these national orgs could help is by saying, like, hey, you're a small local paper that only has one photographer. Like, how about we send our videographer over? I know you don't have a drone. What if we bring our drone? Like, we have a data reporter. Yeah. Or something like that.
We also have some similar resource issues.
But and it helps buy credibility. That's the funny thing about parachuting journalists is you come in, you write the story, and people will bring it to you and like, did you see that the Washington Post or Bloomberg, or I'm not trying to call it anyone specifically, some big national outlet wrote this great story about this issue, and it's like, yes, they interviewed the 6 people that we have written about exhaustively for years, but people love it because they're like, oh my gosh, it means something to us that a national organization covered it. It means something that CNN came into this project, like it means something to them. And I think that that's one of the good things about collaborations, potential collaborations between national and local, is it proves to our audience, hey, like we're here all the time, and we're here, and we're buying the national orgs the credibility, but also you are buying us more credibility with our audience of saying, you know, I know you think the New York Times is fake news or whatever it is, and maybe not the Miami Herald, or vice versa. Like we found that both. And tips I would say is really, you just have to have a lot of conversations with them first. And if you have something you can offer them, think about it. Like we have data, we have visualizations, we have a bigger audience is a resource.
This is like I had documents, the one I'm thinking about right now, so there was like a clear trade-off.
Oh, yeah.
But I just, like it was so interesting when I talked to the editors, they're like, so, but like there feels like there should be a catch, right? And they're like, yeah, like do we have to pay you, or like, are you gonna pay us? Like, what's that? I was like, do we have to sign something? Like, no, we're just gonna share because we're not competitors.
Although maybe signing something's good. I know some collaborations have contracts, and in some cases that
Contracts are good.
They're good, yes. You want a contract. If you
We like
can, if it's a
contracts.
bigger project, the contracts really make a difference. We found if you have an agreement, otherwise someone's like, oh, we'll do this project in 2 months, and 2 more months, and 2 more months. It has been 3 years, and ProPublica is banging on our door saying, where is that project?
Yeah, contracts really protect the smaller news organizations, especially.
We have a question here.
You talked a lot about the collaboration, Alex, but I did want to, because there's so many different kinds of collaboration, and all of the, they have different models of how they do it. So I wanted to know about what have been some of the challenges in getting that reporting project you're talking about with the 18 local news organizations like up and running, like for example, and like just maybe you could shed some light on just the practical aspects of how you do it. Like how often do you communicate? How do you communicate? How do you decide on what stories to do and when to publish? You know, just kind of like the nitty gritty of it. And then the other question is, do you partner also with like the local Spanish language media?
So I'll start with that one real fast first because Lautaro is here. And so the Miami Herald is really lucky in that we have a sister paper that we cross-publish almost everything, the El Nuevo Herald in Spanish. And they have a really great dedicated social media reach that's actually bigger than the Miami Herald. So we have a bigger print reach, but they have more Facebook followers and Twitter followers, which is kind of something people don't know. But they have a great dedicated big audience that we're trying to tap into more. I don't believe anyone else in our collaboration has. I don't think anyone else publishes in Spanish, but some of the stuff that comes in from the collaboration, we do cross-publish in the El Nuevo Herald, which is great for us. And we're exploring more ways to tap into that audience and tell more Spanish-preferred audience stories. But for the nitty-gritty, we have a Slack channel, and that's been pretty primarily how things work. So if you write a story, we have a 24-hour embargo. So you post the link in there, and then you copy and paste the text because it's easier to post into various CMSs, and then you share photos in a separate channel with the captions. You pick 2 or 3 photos, you put the text, and then we also came up with a piece of language that goes in the bottom of every story. So if you're sharing a story, it has to have, this is produced as a collaboration between the Florida Climate Reporting Network, which was founded by, and of course it has the 5 news organizations that started it, which is kind of a vanity thing, but also kind of great for us because we were one of the first 5. And then it links to every organization wrote their own version of why we did this press or why we did this, and that links there. And then you also have to click you have to do something technologically that makes it so Google can't index that version of the story. So that if you search for it, the SEO goes to the original version, which is important in a place where clicks matter for your job. And so we have that and a couple other small digital things. That way the story works in print, it works online, but if you are searching for it, then the national audience coming for it doesn't find my story at the Tampa Bay Times. It doesn't find WLRN's coverage in the Naples Daily News. It finds it where it was born. And sometimes people forget to check the box, but most of the time they don't. And then we have bi-weekly, every other week we have a call that about 12 people regularly attend, and it's 3 or 4 people from some newsrooms, nobody from other newsrooms. It's kind of static, or it's kind of all over the place, and we talk about what stories are coming up. That has not been the most helpful, I would say, just because we just post stuff as they come, and sometimes people are like, oh, I have this story coming, and you know how reporters are, you don't hear about that story for 2 months. So it doesn't really help to hear about it every 2 weeks. But we mostly use those calls to kind of figure out how these big projects are working, and the way that worked is we didn't really know we were going to do these larger projects until one of the editors said it in an interview with Brian Stelter, and they were like, oh, we're doing big projects. Now we've heard it on the news. It's happening, which was a fun realization. And so then we started realizing we have to apply for grant funding. Everyone toss in your ideas, and we just that's sort of what we're working through the problems is how do these group reported projects work? How often do you bring in other people? It's easier to collaborate with the 2 other South Florida outlets. It's harder to collaborate for co-reporting on an interview in the Key West with someone from Jacksonville. It's not quite the way it works for us. But so we're figuring that out, and that's kind of where more of the bumps are. But really the Slack channel is really easy to set up. We have a phone tree on Excel, where we have everyone's email that gets added into group emails if need be, and that's been surprisingly smooth.
Yeah, I have a question over here.
I'm still thinking around this language topic. I hope that you're not all tired about this topic, otherwise I discuss it later with you. But I thought about this whole evening because, of course, we want to reach people, and now I heard people saying yesterday, if you say climate crisis or sometimes even climate change, they don't want to read this anymore. And you said, Alex, that you did some research or at least user experience studies or whatever, what people did when you have climate change in the headlines or in the article. And I wonder if your readers get more open to these words and the fact that climate change is human-made, just because this is a topic in your area since years, and whatever, the houses get more lose value because of climate change. So are people? Well, the question is, that was complicated. The question is, are people more open to these words? And what is your experience with these words?
Yeah, so I've only been covering climate change in South Florida for 2 years, and even then I've noticed a dramatic drop in the comments of people on our Facebook posts of stories who are like, climate change is a Chinese hoax, or whatever they happen to say. It's always been cold, it's always flooded, and usually we would run these climate change stories, which were sort of rare from our environmental desk, but did come years in the past. The commenters were a lot more denialist, and we've started to see a shift. But we don't necessarily put it in, I mean, there's still plenty of people in South Florida who don't believe in climate change. Don't understand the evidence, sorry. And they don't think it's an issue for them. And they don't, so when you tuck it into a story about should a Dorian have been a Category 6, which is really a sneaky way to bring someone into a story about all the impacts climate change has and hurricanes, that's a headline that'll grab their attention more than how climate change is affecting hurricanes for our particular audience. In some cases, you can't avoid putting climate change in the headline. Sometimes if you have it in the story, you can bring them in a different way. I don't have any data on it. This is just pure anecdotal evidence of what's high on Parsley or Chartbeat or other metrics software and the amount of angry emails I get, which is my sort of impromptu way of figuring this stuff out. And we're still, it's all an experiment for us. What language works, what language doesn't work. I love hearing about climate communication best practices, and I try to do some of it. We don't write believe, we write understand the evidence, and some of our stories, we have like a little line explaining what climate change is and how it happens, and what you can do at the bottom. Like some of that stuff we're testing to see if people respond to it. But yeah, the climate crisis isn't a word that we have put in our coverage yet because people are still having a lot of trouble with just climate change. But maybe one day we'll change that, maybe soon.
Maybe you can check
Maybe
out
me.
and help to change it.
I'd be interested, Lisa, in hearing from you. You've heard us talk a little bit about what it's like to do these collaborations, and they're kind of, what's that?
We've done a few. I mean,
Well, and talking with you earlier, it sounds like a lot of this work that we're doing with other organizations, you do similar work within your organization. I mean, it sounds like the dynamics could be similar.
I mean, and outside. And, I mean, to answer your question, I mean, I think the how it works is, is very unique to the precise team that happens to come together. I did a project with ProPublica early in the, sort of mid, I forget, it must have been 2018, on the number of people that were leaving the Environmental Protection Agency and the brain drain from that organization. And ProPublica, with their amazing data, folks, they had gotten a huge FOIA dump with the names and details of everyone that had left the agency. They came to us, we discussed, how would we do it? We kind of thought out just together with our editors, okay, what would a story look like? How would we divide the work? Who would edit it? Which is, was not an uncomplicated thing. In this case, we decided that I would do the main writing of the story, and our editors would edit it, then kick it back over to them to see if there was, problems, additions, adds. They did a sidebar that I think we opted not to run, but it was, it was a discussion every day of how we do it. My colleague John Schwartz did a collaboration with Times-Picayune on sea level rise, in Louisiana. It's not uncommon for us to do it, but it is hard. It's not, it is something that you have to think about and make happen if you want it to happen.
And does that happen at your level, or does somebody above you say this is going to happen?
Well, I mean, in my experience, so I've only done myself this one collaboration, and that one came to me where, ProPublica approached me and said, hey, what do you think about doing this? And I said, I don't know, I'm pretty new here. Let me ask how this works. And our editors were open to it. And, for us, ProPublica was a known quantity. We had done collaborations with them before. I am now getting excited about the idea of thinking of, what kinds of collaborations we can do and what we might think of with local papers. So, I don't know how that would go. I will let you know next time you have this.
One of the things I've covered the Sunrise movement, which we have some Sunrise folks in the back, or one person at least. And since we have this collaboration with stations around the country, nearly all of the folks in that collaboration are younger than me. And so it was really helpful to hear from somebody with a different perspective than I have, growing up in the 80s. We haven't more questions? Probably have time for one more. Anybody have any big innovation or collaboration or creative ideas that you've been thinking about and you want to test before a whole bunch of experts in 5 minutes? Yes, go ahead.
I was gonna mention we do, I don't think it's come up, we do have the climate desk, which is a collaboration between a bunch of national reporting outlets on climate change, and basically right now it's like run through Mother Jones, and it's basically a way for us to like pick up each other's stories and run them. But a couple of us are trying to do more kind of like co-byline work where we know we're already working on the same things, and kind of like seeing the same kind of reporting where it just makes sense to share resources and just publish in the, you know, the two outlets where we have a different audience.
That's one of the things that led to our collaboration, because I was in Denver and then I'm in Philadelphia, and in both places there were a lot of really good reporters. And so I'd show up and like I'd been assigned a story or I pitched a story and it was accepted. And I'd show up and it's like, oh, here's that reporter I hear on my local radio station every day. Does this really make sense for both of us to be here?
Right, like why try to beat each other when you can just do it together?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Any more questions?
Yeah, but I'll chime in that
Yeah.
I used to run a different collaboration and at NPR, and I mean it's the competition thing is something that's come up, and we've just found it a non-issue. And like people care, you know, journalists really care, and there's plenty of reporting to go around. So we find when the health and now the energy environment calls, like the people happily share sources, like call this person, please replicate my story in your market, please, you know, please feel free to use my reporting or clip from whatever. It's like, I find these collaborations really inspiring and really worth it. And they are hard, hire good editors, man, you need them to wrangle all these moving parts, which you're talking about with all the different beasts and deciding who edits what and how they go. They can get really unwieldy, but they're great and they're worth it, and the reporters seem to like them.
I mean, I think with a lot of this, it starts with like a reporter or an editor who really wants to do it and makes it happen, right? I mean, there's no magical.
I think too, like I increasingly, if I'm gonna cover something in a place where I haven't been a lot before, I find the reporter who's the expert and I email them and I'm like, I'm not trying to copy you.
Right.
You're doing great work. Just tell me like where the landmines are. Can you talk to me for 20 minutes about this? And they're like, oh, thank God. Because if you parachute in and you write a story that's like a little bit off, then that's gonna like ruin their month. You know?
Right.
So
Makes
like, a
everybody
lot of people are willing to help.
Yeah.
And links help. Clicks are our life, so links are great.
Yeah, and that's kind of been a practice in radio too, because you got to at least be able to say the name of the place right. And that's going to be a call to somebody.
Can I just add?
Yes.
I know that we're almost out of time. We have if people are interested in solutions journalism, we have a bunch of resources that are online. The network is about 5,000 journalists who have joined, and there's webinars and toolkits and this collection of 8,000 stories. And we talk about the solutions journalism imposters, the silver bullet story, the CNN hero story, all that. So it's just, if you're interested in incorporating this into your work, and all of it is basically gathered from these thousands of journalists, it's sort of like learning from many other people's practice.
Very good. Thanks so much for the good discussion.
Thank you.